In Southern California, there is a huge inland sea. It covers hundreds of square kilometers in the middle of the desert. It has beaches, fish, boats, and even towns along its shores. But there is one problem. Nobody was supposed to create this sea. No one dug a giant basin for it. No one built a massive dam. There was never supposed to be a huge body of water here at all. More than a century ago, people were simply trying to bring water into the desert. Then one engineering mistake allowed an entire river to change course and begin flooding a massive depression in the landscape. That is how the Salton Sea was born. And for almost 2 years, people struggled to stop the water from rising. At the beginning of the 20th century, southeastern California was an extremely dry place. But nearby flowed the Colorado River, one of the largest river systems in the region. Settlers wanted to use its water to irrigate the Imperial Valley. The problem was that the farmland lay far below the river, in an area where the climate was brutally dry, so the California Development Company began building a network of canals to divert part of the Colorado River into the valley. One of the main channels became known as the Alamo Canal. By the fall of 1904, hundreds of kilometers of canals were already operating in the valley, and large areas of desert had been transformed into farmland. But the new canal had a serious problem. The Colorado River carried enormous amounts of silt, and the canal was quickly filling with it. Engineers had to find a way to keep the water moving. In 1904, heavy flooding filled the first several kilometers of the canal with silt. Water could no longer reach the Imperial Valley properly, so the engineers made what they believed would be a temporary fix. They cut a new channel to connect the Colorado River directly with an older riverbed known as the Alamo River. The bypass was never supposed to become a permanent part of the river system. It was meant to be closed before the next major flood. That was why it did not have the kind of heavy protective structures that a permanent river channel would require. At first, the solution seemed perfectly reasonable. There was only one problem. The Colorado River had other plans. In the spring of 1905, another major flood arrived. A huge volume of water rushed into the temporary channel. At first, it looked like an ordinary flood, but the water began eroding the channel itself. The deeper the channel became, the more water entered it, and the more water entered, the more aggressively it eroded the channel. A chain reaction had begun. Eventually, a huge portion of the Colorado River started flowing away from its normal route and into the Imperial Valley. Then the water moved toward a vast natural depression known as the Salton Sea. It was one of the lowest points in the region, and now an entire river was pouring into it. At first, the water flooded farmland, then roads, then railroad tracks. And soon it became obvious that the problem was much larger. The water kept coming. Once it entered the natural basin, there was almost nowhere for it to escape. The river continued flowing. That meant the new body of water continued rising. Eventually, one fact became impossible to ignore. People were accidentally creating a massive inland sea. According to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, water continued flowing into the basin for almost 2 years and eventually flooded roughly 330,000 acres of land. But the worst part was just beginning, because the entire region depended on infrastructure that was now being swallowed by water. One of the main casualties was the Southern Pacific Railroad. Its tracks crossed the Imperial Valley, and the rising water was getting closer and closer. Engineers tried to protect the railroad embankment. Workers built barriers. They piled sandbags along the tracks and used other materials to hold back the water. Historical photographs from the period even show workers trying to defend the railroad from the expanding lake. But the river was stronger, and soon it became clear that the railroad was not the only thing at risk. If the flow could not be stopped, enormous parts of the valley would disappear beneath the water. Engineers and workers repeatedly tried to force the river back into its original channel. They built embankments. They filled in breaches. They used enormous amounts of rock, soil, and construction material. But every attempt was attacked by the current. The temporary channel had already become a full-scale river, and now a huge portion of the Colorado was flowing through it. For a while, it seemed as if people simply could not stop the river. The water kept widening the channel, and the Salton Sea kept growing. Historical records show that during one period in 1906, the water level was rising by roughly 7 inches per day, 7 inches, every single day. This was no longer a simple engineering accident. It had become a race between a handful of engineers and an entire river. Something even stranger was happening. This basin had actually flooded long before modern canals existed. Thousands of years ago, the Colorado River periodically changed course and sent water into this same low-lying region. A much larger prehistoric lake, known as Lake Cahuilla, formed and disappeared repeatedly. When the river changed direction, the water stopped coming in. The lake slowly evaporated. The modern Salton Sea appeared in a very different way. People accidentally forced the Colorado River into the basin and kept it there for roughly 18 months. And although the landscape had always been capable of holding a lake, human engineering turned the accidental flood into a permanent part of the region. Now there was only one question left. How do you stop an entire river? By the end of 1906, the situation had become so serious that the Southern Pacific Railroad was forced to intervene. The company launched a massive operation to close the breach. Workers used enormous quantities of rock and soil. They tried to build a barrier across the opening where the river had broken through the old channel. The first major attempt was completed in November of 1906. For a moment, it looked as though the crisis was finally over. But then another flood arrived, and in December the water broke through the new barrier. The Colorado River was flowing into the Salton Sink once again. It seemed almost absurd. People built a dam. The river destroyed it. They built another one, and the river won again. But eventually, the engineers succeeded. On February 10, 1907, the breach was finally closed. The Colorado River returned to its natural course. The water stopped pouring into the basin. The disaster was over. But by then, there was already an enormous new sea in the middle of the desert. Over nearly 2 years, the water had raised the surface of the Salton Sink by dozens of meters. Huge areas of land had disappeared. Roads, farmland, and infrastructure were underwater, and in the middle of the desert, a new body of water had formed. It was roughly 45 miles long and up to 20 miles wide, and it was not going anywhere. At first, the Salton Sea looked like nothing but a disaster. But gradually, people discovered an unexpected consequence. Fish appeared in the lake. Birds gathered around it. Later, communities, hotels, and recreational areas developed along its shores. The Salton Sea became a popular destination. Its ecosystem also became an important stop for migratory birds. What had started as an engineering accident slowly became a real part of the landscape and life of the region. Today, it is difficult to imagine Southern California without this enormous body of water, even though it exists because of a mistake. The Salton Sea is one of the strangest examples of how human engineering can permanently reshape a landscape. Nobody planned to create a sea here. People were simply trying to bring irrigation water into a desert valley, but the temporary channel broke. The Colorado River changed course. Water began flooding the desert. Engineers spent almost 2 years trying to stop the flow, and when they finally succeeded, the new sea had already become a permanent part of the landscape. Perhaps the strangest part of the entire story is how simple the original cause was. To create a huge sea, people did not need to build a massive dam. All it took was one poorly protected breach, one powerful river, and one mistake in engineering. After that, the water did the rest. And that is how, in 1905, a sea appeared in the middle of the California desert where no sea was ever supposed to exist.